Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a good night. I am King Pigley. This is Gaming Imperfectly. Welcome back to the channels, guys. And if you are new to the channel, I am King Pigley, and I hope you like what you see. Guys, I got a great story for you today. If you know about the Diavolo Pass, this story is in the same vein, but instead of happening in 1959, it happened in 1993. And it is a weird one. So get ready. So, back in 1993, a Russian survival instructor and hiking instructor named Yumila Kornavina decided to take a group of her students, six of her students in fact, up to Hamar Daban Ridge, which is a mountain range that is in eastern Siberia. Now, the kids and the people that she was taking were and had been students of hers for quite some time, and they loved Yumila very much. In fact, a lot of her students prior to this, went on and grew up to become very dedicated people in their professions and life, and they contribute a lot of their mindset and mentality about how to handle life and intense situations to Yumila's instructions when they were young. She was beloved by everybody that knew her. She had a 16-year-old daughter who was also an avid hiker and instructor. And in fact, her 16-year-old daughter, was going to be taking a separate group up to the Hamar Daban Ridge as well, just at at the same time, just two different groups. So Yumila was going to go with a group of six, and her daughter was going to go with another group. Now, Yumila was taking a young man named Sasha, who was 23 years old, and he was super fit, and she really had raised Sasha. So she referred to him as her son. I mean, she had a wonderful relationship with Sasha, and she had raised him since he was a little boy. And so for all intents and purposes, Sasha was her son. And he was going to go with Yumila. Going along with Yumila, aside from Sasha, who was 23, was Tatiana, who was 24, Dennis, who was 19, Timur, who was 15, and Valentina, who was 17. Now, the only reason we know anything that happened during this story is because of Valentina, so pay attention to her. Because, guys, this is crazy stuff right here. You can't, sometimes life is stranger than fiction. You certainly can't make up stuff like this. So, on August the 1st, this group of six, Yumila and her six students, including Sasha, her adopted son, arrived by train into a town in Siberia. They left Kazakhstan and they arrived in Merino. They stayed the night in Merino, and the next morning they got up and they made transportation arrangements. They went to the base of the Hamar Daban Ridge, and they started their trek. And the weather was beautiful. Now, this happened in August, so it's still summertime, technically speaking. But the weather forecast was for beautiful weather. I mean, they were looking forward to this. Everybody was excited. And Yumila was the kind of person that instilled a sense of can do and don't quit and comfort amongst you, because she was very well versed in the outdoors, and so she really knew what she was doing, which made you feel very comfortable with her when you were out in the wilds. So they started out on this trek on August the 1st, Yumila and all six of her students, including, of course, Sasha, who was kind of like her assistant, during this expedition. So the trip itself was a total of 50 miles. They were going to make their way up the Hamar Daban Ridge, and once they got to the top, at the top they were going to, there was shelter and fire. They could have fire, and they were going to camp out for the night at the ridge itself. Before they got up there, they were actually supposed to link up with Yumila's 16-year-old daughter, who was leading a separate group. And it was all planned out, very much so. Nothing's left to chance. They were all well provisioned, and they were all well equipped. The first day or two of their journey actually went without event. They made their way through beautiful terrain in Siberia. They made their way through a forest. And eventually, though, on the third day, they came to the edge of the forest. Because, if you've ever been to any big mountain ranges, there's a forest line. And eventually you go above the forest line, there's not a tree to be seen. And so they came to the forest line and they started making their way up the Hamar Daban mountain ridge to get to the summit. But along the way then, on the third or fourth day, they ran in, the weather started to change. The weatherman was actually completely wrong, and by the fourth day, it was pouring rain and snow. The temperatures dropped drastically, and it was really becoming an absolute misery to hike, at all, to move. They slowed down greatly. Of course, they did have some younger members, like Timur, who was 15. And so Yumila, being very aware of this, was keeping a very close eye on her group because this was really, really rotten weather. And if any of you guys are campers or outdoors people or hikers, you know hiking in crap weather is just zero fun. And camping in weather like this is even less fun. But they pushed on because Tatiana kept saying, we can do this, if we just go a little further. So on the 5th of August, guys, they stopped. They were about 2.5 miles from the summit. And because they had been going really slowly, they had actually were off a day for meeting up with Yumila's daughter. And Yumila understood this. So her plan was to hit the summit, but to turn around immediately instead of staying the night up there, since they were already like a day behind due to the bad weather, and make their way to the rendezvous point with her daughter. But at 2.5 miles away from the summit, for whatever reason, Yumila decided that they needed to stop. She wasn't one to really, even her students didn't ask her to stop. According to Valentina, what happened is that none of them really, they believed in Yumila. And so when she would ask them to push through the pain and discomfort of this horrible weather, they would. And so they stopped for the night at this place. And Yumila surprised them all when she turned around and said, we're going to stop here, guys. And we don't know whether Yumila just saw that her students were struggling. We don't know what she was thinking. She was 2.5 miles from the summit, from their location. Maybe because of the bad weather, visibility was crap. You couldn't see anything, and so they don't know whether maybe she didn't know how close she was to the summit. But for whatever reason, she decided to stop. That's not the odd thing. The odd thing is not that she decided to stop and give her students a rest, because she was a very caring and motherly lady. It was where she decided to stop. And it was out right in the open. They could have turned around and walked a couple of miles down the mountain to the forest line and camped there. They didn't. For whatever reason, Yumila said, we're stopping and we're staying here. So they basically dug into the snow that had fallen and set up their tents. They took ropes and strapped them down. And the wind is howling 30, 40 miles per hour. And they all curl inside their tents and they're just cold and they're miserable. And they're trying to sleep. But at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the ropes break loose of their tents, and the tents are blowing in the wind, and so they have to get out in the middle of the night, reattach their tents, which they're able to do, and get back in their tents. And then it happens again, and this time when the rope break, the tent actually kind of blows up and water comes pouring in from the rain and the ice and the snow that has been falling, and their sleeping bags get wet, and it's just a really crap situation. And they reattach the ropes and they attach their tents back to the ground. They curl in there and they're all huddled up and they're trying to use their body heat to keep warm. But it's really a very bad situation. Around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, Valentina wakes up and she notices that Yumila is standing outside the tent looking around, with her hands on her hips, kind of looking around at the situation. Valentina goes outside as well, and she goes, Yumila, are you okay? And she says, yes. We have to leave. We can't stay here, because Yumila understood that they're wet, they're cold. This is becoming a super dangerous situation, and they are like borderline hypothermic at this time. It's not good. And so she tells them, tells Valentina, help me wake everyone. Go wake Sasha. We need to get everybody up. We need to pack up. We need to get off this mountain. So the plan was to hike down to the forest, and by missing the summit, by skipping the summit altogether, they were directly on track to meet up with Yumila's 16-year-old daughter, who is leading the second group. Now, A few days later, I'll do this in a kind of strange storytelling way. Now, a few days later, on the 9th of August, some kayakers are paddling down the river that runs through and around the Hamar Daban mountain range. And it's a beautiful day, and they're looking around and they're enjoying the mountain scenery when suddenly one of the kayakers looks over to the edge of the river, and standing there is a girl, and she's covered in blood, and she's just kind of blankly staring at the kayakers as they're kind of meandering past. And the guy that saw her, his first response was, "We got to get the hell out of here. You know, this is creepy as hell. We're out in the middle of nowhere. This girl should not be here, and she's covered in blood. You know." But his senses kind of, you know, the initial shock of seeing her and startled, realized that, you know, we have to help this child. I mean, something's not right, obviously. And so they paddle over to the edge, and, you know, they tentatively get out and they walk up to her, and it's Valentina. And they go, you know, "Are you okay?" And she wouldn't answer them. She wouldn't respond to them in any way. And so they ask, you know, they try to talk to her. "What happened to you? How did you get out here?" Nothing. So they put blankets around her, and they try to make her comfortable, and they get her in a kayak, and then they make their way back to town. And they get her to the authorities, and the authorities start asking her, "What happened? Can you tell us what's going on?" And eventually, she tells them what occurred. So, going back to the Yumila standing outside the tent, Valentina, when she asked Valentina to help her wake everybody up, that they were going to head down to the forest to get out of the storm. By this time, it was like 6 in the morning, and they had packed up their entire camp. They were all geared up, and they started heading down the mountain towards the forest line, and Sasha was walking in front. He was leading the group. Now, again, he's 23 years old. He's probably the fittest one of the group, and all of a sudden, Sasha falls down. And so, you know, Yumila runs over to him, and you know, so does the other group, and they pick him up, and, you know, and he kind of looks a little disoriented, a little wild, but he's, you know, he's like, "Whoa," you know. And they kind of like, "Hey, man," you know, Yumila's like, "Are you know, okay? You got to steady yourself." He's like, "Yeah, I'm fine," you know. A little confused, but he seems okay. And so he starts walking again, leading the group, and then suddenly, you know, he just kind of goes rigid standing in front of them, and he slowly turns his head towards the group, turns around, and as he does, his blood is pouring out of his eyes and his ears and his nose and his mouth. And he looks absolutely terrified. And he collapses to the ground, just falls down to the ground. And Yumila freaks out. You know, this is her adopted son. So the group leader, you know, everybody else in the group is freaking out as well. But, I mean, this is what... He had no signs that anything was wrong with him 30 minutes prior when they were packing up their camp. And so now Sasha, the most fit of the group, is laying on the ground, bleeding out. I mean, the snow is turning red. Yumila runs to him, and she grabs him, and she's, "Sasha," and she's crying, and she's like, she's checking for a pulse, and she looks up at the group, and she's like, "He's dead." And, you know, and everybody's just kind of like, "Holy crap," you know, they don't know what to do. And Yumila's just rocking him and holding Sasha. She's crying. She's so upset. And then suddenly she looks up at the group and she says, just go down the mountain, get to the tree line. And they were like, "Yumila, you have to come with us." And they were like, "We can't do this without you." And she's like, "No, I'm not leaving Sasha." And all hell is breaking loose. But Valentina kind of kicks into gear with Tatiana, who is now the 24-year-old Tatiana, and the 17-year-old Valentina kind of go, "Okay, guys," you know, to the younger guy, "let's go." And they start making their way down the mountain towards the tree line when suddenly they hear Yumila yelling, "Come back, come back." And they turn around and start making their way up to him. She's like, "I can't move." And they hear her, and they're making their way back to Yumila. But by the time they get to her, she is blood is pouring out of her ears and her mouth. And she's clutching at herself, and she's just kind of trembling. And she curls up and falls over Sasha and dies. And so now the group is in complete chaos. The kids don't know what to do. Tatiana, the 24-year-old girl, doesn't know what to do. Valentina's looking around like, "What the hell?" And she turns towards the rest of the group. And it's at that point in time that Victoria and Tatiana start clutching at their throats, and blood is coming out of their eyes and coming out of their nose and coming out of their ears. And they're frothing at the mouth and grabbing at their necks. And they're wrenching and writhing. And they fall to the ground, twisting and everything else. And Valentina runs up to Victoria and tries to help her, and Victoria actually bites her on the hand, and she like pulls her hand back, and she's like, and she looks around, and Timur and Dennis is kind of like, oh, heading over behind some rocks, and Tatiana and Victoria fall to the ground dead. After writhing in agony, they just kind of ball up and go still, and she like sees Dennis go behind this pile of rocks that is nearby, but she notices that he seems to be okay, and she looks over towards Timur, who's now clutching at his neck, and again frothing at the mouth and bleeding profusely from his orifices, and he falls to the ground, and eventually, he starts going a little writhing, and he smashes his head on a rock a couple of times, and then goes still. She goes behind the rock, and there's Dennis, and when he turns around and he looks at her, he is now bleeding as well, but he's still talking to her, and he says, look, get your gear, go down to the forest, I'll meet you there. And she doesn't know what to do, so she does what he says, and so she goes over, she grabs her backpack again, she grabs the gear that she'll need, she goes back behind the rocks, but there's Dennis slumped to the ground turning red with his blood as it pours out of his body, and he apparently is dead. And she's grabbing at her face and making sure there's no blood, other than the blood that she now has on her from trying to help Victoria and Valentina and all these other people that have died around her. So she goes down into the woods, and the wind is howling, and the storm is just everywhere. And she's terrified at this point in time. And she just kind of finds this nook in a rock, and trees are falling because the wind is blowing so hard now. The storm is like just raging. And she is, Valentina is just so terrified that what just happened to the entire group is going to happen to her at any minute. And if that doesn't kill her, obviously the storm is going to kill her as it rages around her. I mean, giant trees falling in the woods. And she just curls up underneath this rock ledge and rocks until she finally passes out of sheer exhaustion and terror. And she wakes up the next morning and the storm is gone. And she goes back up the mountain to where her comrades were, her dead friends, and she had some hope that maybe it was some horrible dream, or maybe that one of them had survived, but unfortunately they were all still exactly where she had left them, and they were all dead. And so she went back down to the tree line, totally lost. She has no idea where to go. She had never been on the Hamar Daban before, and she was relying on Yamila to get her to where they needed to go. I mean, she didn't even have a map or anything. And I guess during this panic time, she didn't think about going through Yamila's stuff and getting the map or anything that might have helped. So she just wandered around the woods for 4 days, guys. Not knowing what to do, until finally on the 4th day she heard voices, and she had managed to wind her way through these woods to this river and happened to see the kayakers. So the kayakers picked her up and took her into town. When they got there, she explained to the authorities once they got her to talk, and she told the authorities what to happen. They launched a massive search to go find the rest of the hikers that they now knew were up on this mountain. It took them a month to find the bodies, but when they did, they were absolutely in the general location where Valentina had told them that she was, or that they were. And there was some weird things that were there that happened. One, all their clothes were missing, and their eyes were missing. Really strange. They had these looks of absolute terror on their faces, according to the reports of the police reports and everything. They were contorted. Their bodies were contorted, and aside from their missing eyes, they had these horrified, terrifying expressions on their faces. The autopsy reports are really unclear. Hypothermia certainly played a role in their deaths, but the weird thing about it is, guys, is that their lungs were super bruised, and they have no idea what caused that. But overall, their cause of death was just listed as exposure and hypothermia, but it doesn't explain anything of what Valentina said happened on that mountain, on the Hamar Daban. So there you go, guys. The Hamar Daban Pass, the mystery of, and what happened there. What do you guys believe could have happened? What do you think the explanation would be? I would love to hear your opinion on this. Again, it's like the Dyatlov Pass, except more recent. Weird things tend to go, apparently, in the mountains of Russia and Siberia. Not a great place to go hiking, if you ask me. But holy crap. So there you go. I mean, like I said, not a great place to go hiking, if you ask me. I'd stay away from hiking in Russia in the mountains. But I would love to hear your opinion on what do you think may have happened, what's going on. You know, is Valentina telling a lie? Did she kill everybody? I mean, what do you think? I don't know. But I tell you what, it's really weird that all their clothes were missing, that their lungs were bruised. It's a really strange thing that happened up on that mountain, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it. But that's it for King Pigley today, guys. If you haven't done it yet, and you are new to the channel, I hope you'll subscribe. Keep coming back. No matter what, guys, please help me out. Hit that like button, smash that bell, get the notifications. Keep coming back and hanging out with me. More stories to come, more mysteries, weird things, macabre, dark stories. I love it. I hope you're enjoying it. But that's it. I'm out of here, and I will see you guys in the next video.